So today I've been asked to talk about, have the rules for brand building changed? Now I'm going to get to that, but before I do, I think it's really useful if I give you a bit of background into the institute that I come from, the Ehrenberg Bass Institute, because I'm going to make a fair few claims that are counter to what most people who talk about marketing will say. And I just don't have the time to give you the evidence, but I do encourage you to get the book if you want to know more. We always start out by thanking our sponsors, partly because we are incredibly grateful for the funding and the data and the insights that they give us. But it also gives you a bit of a flavour to who we are. We're interested in how things crawl across all different sorts of categories, be they consumer goods, finances, durables, cars, anything like that. We're interested in across category knowledge and across countries. So that's the sort of stuff that I'm going to give you today. We're also lucky enough to work with some amazing brands. And the good thing I think about this is that they help us translate the science into what it is that you need to do with the knowledge. So I've mentioned science. I actually come from this group. There are 60 plus marketing scientists. We don't wear white coats, but we do the hard work of science. So that means we literally study the world of marketing. We study how is it that brands grow, how is it that people buy? How is it that they shop? How is it that they choose? And particularly, how is it that you can influence it? What works to influence that behaviour and what doesn't? And so that's the focus of the science that we do. And it's really hard work. And the sort of stuff I'm talking about today has 50 years of science behind it, which is incredibly rare in the discipline of marketing. So one thing that we found in bringing science to marketing is that as soon as you put the lens of a scientist onto our discipline, is you find that the world is not as it seemed. So when people first came out and said the world's round, it's just not flat, they were ridiculed. I've been ridiculed, Byron's been ridiculed. Some of the stuff that we're saying is very controversial. It's not that we ever set out to be controversial. It's just when you actually take the lens of science and study the world and you look at it repeatedly over time in as many different ways as possible, you see that the world is not actually as we thought it was. It's not that marketers are dumb. It's just that marketing is a very young discipline that has not been founded in science. It's been founded by people who are excited and energetic and doing things and coming up with ideas of how it works, and that's all great. But we've got a few things wrong. So we love this quote from the Chief Marketing and Commercial Officer at Coke, where having been exposed to our science, he says, you know, science has revolutionised every discipline it's touched, and now it's marketing's turn. And we see that this is absolutely happening when people start to look at the science. So what I encourage you to do is look at your own data through this lens if there's something that you don't believe. And if you find an exception, let me know, because we've been looking for decades and we hardly find any of them. So that's kind of the introduction, because I didn't want to bore you with bucket loads of data, but it gives you the perspective with which I'll talk. So I'm going to talk about, have the rules for brand building changed? Easy enough, but I thought, well, what are the rules for brand building? We probably need to start there. Now, I'm a mum of two little girls, a 7- and a 10-year-old, and I'm pretty good at rules these days. You can't have Nutella for breakfast every day. You have to do violin before school. No playing on the railway track outside our house. You know, I'm pretty good. Lots of people can give rules. And there are bucket loads of marketing consultants out there, research providers, ad agencies. You know, they're giving you rules for how to manage your brands. Most of them are wrong. So we need to kind of evaluate rules, because clearly not all rules and not all recommendations are equal. Some matter, some are not particularly harmful, but they're not really that important either, and some are just out wrong. So let's look at the sort of rules that I want to focus on. I'm focusing on those that are really fundamental rules about how to build a brand and how to grow a brand. So if you want to make a meringue, you know, a pretty fundamental rule is you have to make it with the egg white and not the yolk, or it's just not going to work. If you want to build a building, you need to work with the laws of gravity rather than just going, I'm too creative, they're not for me. You know, your building just won't stand up. So once you know that rule, you can have a huge amount of creativity and play with it in different ways so that you end up with, buildings and bridges that look quite different to what other people have done. But you have to get that fundamental bit right of working with gravity if you want it to stand up. Now, I was going to share the example of needing to be female if you want to get pregnant. So I went looking for an image for this one, and Thomas came up. And there are actually a couple of people in the US who'd probably fall into this same category. He highlighted that, there might be a few grey areas. Sex change, had a baby, legally male, it's a grey area. I know of some of the exceptions of the things that I'm going to talk about today, but they're very much the really, really odd exception. Like we've got 2 examples of this in the world. So what I'm talking about is most brands, most of the time, in most situations. And if you've got one of these exceptions in the branding space, please do come and talk to me about it, because I'd love to know. So now we've kind of got that bit out of the way, and we can talk about the real crux of how is it that brands build. How is it that you can instantaneously recognise any of these brands simply from its colour, from the shape of a bottle, from a logo, that you can recognise them, with foreign languages in different parts of the world? There's lots to it. So let's start with a little bit of a history lesson to see how it is that the current brands have grown to where they are, and then we can look forward in terms of, well, what's going to happen in this new world where media is so fragmented and the world has changed. Well, once upon a time, looking back, we see that there were large national manufacturers, and they had nationally known brands, all very lovely. They were sold through millions of family-owned shops. That's put forward as the era where life was good, things were easy for manufacturers and easy for brands. But if we take a step a little bit further back, we see that before that there were thousands and thousands of manufacturers and no nationally known brands. Way back, just local stores, lots of really small manufacturers, and it was things like reputation, relationships, and location that mattered. So kind of if we look at that worldview and the growing, what happened to change it to the brands that we know today? Well, there are a couple of key things that mattered. The first, without question, is that mass media happened. So it started with print. It moved to radio, to TV, and then to digital. We should not forget the lesson of mass media. It is what has helped create the brands of today. I'm sure many of you recognise the ad that's playing. Clearly, it's a classic. But I think it demonstrates the amazing power of mass media. That ad was only shown twice, and once was just to make sure that it classified for the awards. And yet it is recognised and the brand by millions around the world. Mass media is incredibly powerful. And I'm going to talk about that in light of where media is heading at the moment, because it is such an important lesson if you want to be in the business of building a brand and you want a brand that will grow. But it's not the only critical ingredient. Absolutely, to build brands, you need mass media, so you need to get to millions of people. You need to get to them regularly to build the memory structures for your brand. And we don't have time to get into all of that today, but a lot of it boils down to how our brains work. And our brains have evolved very, very slowly. They're absolutely amazing. And if you haven't got into some of the new brain science, the new knowledge about how the brain works, how memory works, how emotion does, you need to, because that is what we're influencing with brands. And a key point here is that brains evolve slowly and they're going to continue to evolve slowly. So when we're trying to influence the brain, don't expect that it's going to change as quickly as the likes of digital media. So the other key ingredient to build brands is chain stores. That's what helped get the biggest brands big. So of those thousands and thousands of manufacturers that existed, the ones that survived were the ones that got into chain stores. And those who got into the stores that grew most were the ones that grew most. So that is the key kind of lesson looking back in history as to what it takes to grow a big brand. We've evolved it a lot now, and we know a lot more about it than just those two things. When We take together all of the evidence that we've been collecting over the last 50 years. We now have a very solid new theory about how it is that marketing works. And it basically boils down to these two pillars. Marketing works by making brands mentally available. So that means they're salient. They're considered in as many purchase situations by as many people as often as possible. They come to mind easily. So it's not about people needing to be persuaded that they're the best. The biggest challenge marketers have is to get considered at all. So mental availability is an absolutely fundamental pillar. The other one is physical availability. So it's not enough just to be in a chain store. That's kind of the history, the olden days. In the new world, physical availability is about being easy to buy for as many people as possible in the full range of situations where they might consider to buy your brand. So I just love this little quote from P&G. So they have recognised the importance of retailers to their brands. So as leading retailers grow, so do P&G brands. But they don't leave it to the retailers. They very much do the out-of-store work as well of ensuring that their brands are mentally available to the millions of people who might need their products. Okay, whenever we present this stuff, and I've been doing it now for decades, we get people saying, well, yes, we love the chain stores and they've been so important to our brand's history. And this is skewed a little bit consumer good, but the lessons are broader. So manufacturers tend to say, well, we do love the retailers. We couldn't be here without them. We love them, hate them. We need them if we've got a launch, but they're so powerful. And similarly, mass media used to be great. It got us to where we are, but yeah, it's so fragmented now. It's a different story. We need to move on. Our advice is never forget this. Yes, that image is old-fashioned, but what it did was ensure that the brand was available to millions of people. So in the new world, we need to take the same lessons and work out how it is that we can get unduplicated reach, how it is that we can get our messages out there to the millions of people around the world, because we're operating in a global world now and there's lots of competition. So it's not as easy as it was in the days of those television sets. We have to work harder, but we still need to do the same thing. So while we say don't forget mass media, we see all around us, around the world, marketers forgetting the lessons of the past. Mass marketing is out. That's scary stuff in terms of, I don't care, I'm a scientist. I don't care if your brands grow or they don't. It's quite fun to watch when they decline as it is to watch when they grow. But just because something is not sexy and it's not cool doesn't mean it doesn't work. Advertising is kind of the old school. The amount of time in meetings where people just don't talk about that and they talk about the sexy new media is amazing. I'm all into the sexy new. I love studying that as well. But what we need is context. And I think Jasper made a really important point up the front is it's really important to know what are the new hot trends and the new next things, but it's equally important to know what hasn't changed. So what we see is that there's massive push to the likes of price promotions and new media. They're the levers that marketers are pulling and that they want to pull. But it's dangerous. There is a paradigm in marketing that revolves around things like people needing to have relationships with their brand, that we want to try and make them love our brand, that we need engagement. These are the buzzwork, and the millions I see being put into this is just absolutely daunting as the independent scientist on the outside, especially when we study what works and what doesn't. There's this paradigm that we need to target, that we need to focus on particular segments, otherwise we'll be wasting our marketing expenditure. That's actually just rubbish. But I'm going to explore that one a little bit. So part of that thinking is consistent with this idea of the 80-20 rule. We need to focus on our best customers because we'll get the highest ROI. And that's what we're on about. We're about avoiding wasting and getting high ROI. I like it, but it's not the route to growth. But let's explore that a little bit further. So in terms of this 80-20 rule, the idea here is that most of our volume is going to come from a small 20% of our customers. It's logical. It makes sense. We like logical things. But when you go and look at the data, it actually doesn't hold. So to read this table, the first row just tells us of people who buy our brand once in whatever time period, they make up 100% of our buyers, 100% of our volume. Easy. People who buy 2+ times, they make up 41% of our buyers, 70% of our volume. The 3+, 20% of our buyers, 50% of our volume. Oi, that's meant to be 80, 50? It's a big difference between 80% of my sales that I'm focusing on and ignoring half of them. And this research wasn't conducted by us, and we have looked at it more recently and across a much broader range of categories. And it's not always 50, often it's 60, depends on the time period you look at and so forth. But it is wrong. So when I ask marketers regularly about what laws of marketing they know, this is the most common. They know about the 80-20 rule. Well, that's the one law that's actually not a law and is wrong, which is kind of scary stuff. But we'll come back to laws in a moment. So just wanted to acknowledge that the world has changed, and people in this room know it better than others. The world is becoming more fragmented in terms of media. There are so many new ways that people can engage with content. They can tailor it. So the world is changing in terms of what's out there being offered, but also how people are engaging with it. Many screens are becoming more common. People are tailoring. They're much, much more in control. Stuff that you all know. But in light of those changes, I wanted to ask the questions of, well, do we actually see that consumer loyalty is declining, as lots of people in the trade press would have us believe? Does mass marketing still work in this new world? And will brands disappear is the big crux that comes out of it. So we'll look at each of those questions now. So the first point I want to make is that despite all the hype, despite all of the energy and the massive investment, the world has changed less than most of the industry would have us believe. So it's not that there's no change. Absolutely there is, but it's more that there's extra choice and extra stuff happening than some of the fundamentals changing. There is a lot more media out there. But when we study, for example, how much people are still viewing television, it hasn't changed that much. So here's a couple of stats from the 80s through to more recently for the UK and the US in terms of average hours of viewing television in a week. There's slight discrepancies in terms of the exact numbers here, depending on whether you count actual viewing as it happens or you include delayed or, so even if we challenge the numbers a little bit and bring it down to 20, the picture is still the same. Mass media is still mass media. It reaches millions of people and it reaches them quickly, something that most new media just don't do. There are more channels, but a couple of channels still dominate in most markets. They get most people, they still have high reach and they still have high share of viewing. They even still have high share of viewing in the households that have 200 channels available to them. We put this down to the human desire for fresh. People want to be able to have the conversation over the water cooler at work about the show that was on TV last night. So it's not that it's all there, the other stuff is happening, but there is still more viewing in this space than many people would have us believe. And it only costs 2 to 4 cents to reach a person in this media, which is not necessarily the case through some of the other ways that you can reach people. So I'm not denying that reach has been lost. When you look back from the 80s and see what the reach was to what it is, this one I think it's 2000 and what it looks like now, it is going down. And there's no surprise. But people still have that commonality and it is still possible to get big reach at the moment. And in terms of what we see, there are some trends that's what will happen because content is key here. So we have to work harder as marketers. You can't reach as many people or as quickly as you could in the past, but mass media is still the fastest way to get reach. It also gives a unique profile of who it is that you can reach. Yes, it does skew to certain retired people watch a lot more of it, but you can reach everybody through this media, which you can't through others. When I say everybody, almost everybody, if you've got a big enough presence. So what we see is that the big channels can reach about 80% of the people in a week that they can reach in a year. Cable channels, only 1 in 5. There are still differences there between the small channels. So I haven't really talked about digital, I need to go quickly. So does mass media still work in this new world? The short answer is yes. When you use the gold standard data, single source, you can see that it nudges the propensities of people who are exposed to buy the advertised brand. We see the same thing in pre-rolls and online, but not as consistently. It doesn't reach as many people, and the sales nudge is less consistent. So people respond to any media, but less so. TV still is working better than anything else. So is consumer loyalty declining? No, loyalty looks like it absolutely always did, and that's what it looks like. So the norm for loyalty is not as our discipline thinks. It is that people are polygamous in their loyalty. They have a subset of brands that they're equally happy buying. They're not promiscuous. They're not out there buying any brand. They do have loyalties, but they're not solely loyal in the vast majority of categories that they purchase from. So loyalty is highly predictable, and we've looked all sorts of categories. Key thing is it hardly ever varies across, or it doesn't vary across competing brands except in predictable ways. So loyalty is sticking to the rules. Can I have a show of hands of who's a marketer or interested in a brand? Quite a few. Keep your hand up if you're using these laws of marketing. Okay, they are the equivalent of the laws of gravity in terms of how you build brands. So if you're not using them and you want to have any success in your brand, you need to know them back to front, inside out, because they are the way that shows you how to grow your brand. It does look a little bit mathsy, but they can be put in words. So the first is the law of double jeopardy. It simply tells us that small brands get hit twice. They will have less customers, and those customers will buy slightly less on average. Has lots of implications for things like how you read market research reports, but also what is the route to growth? The route to growth is just to get more customers. Don't put any energy in terms of trying to increase people's loyalty. Don't put any energy into trying to get them to buy you more often. That's swimming upstream. You won't succeed in terms of growth. Our next law was this one, the negative binomial distribution. This pattern's been documented for 50 years. It shows us, all brands show this pattern. The numbers are different, but it just tells us that your most normal customer is a light customer. You have hardly any heavy customers. And the route to growth is just to nudge the entire curve up, which in practice mostly means that you're talking to people who hardly ever buy you, who don't know much about you, and who don't care. So it's true, but they're the route to growth. So in terms of any activity you've got, think people who are light buyers, who don't know much about me and don't care, and if you reach them, that's how you'll grow. The third law there was the duplication of purchase law. This just shows us who you will compete with. So you will share customers in line with your competitive brands solely in line with their size. It has nothing to do with the positioning that they've got. It's got nothing to do with their personality. It's got nothing to do with the segment that they're targeting. All of that stuff is rubbish. It just does not show in the data. Competition is absolutely based on how big you are. So how physically available you are and how big you are in the mind of category users. So I'm going to miss this example because I forgot to look at the time as I started, but Coke shares absolutely predictably with Pepsi. There are some sub-patterns, but we can talk about them over the book signing. So the big bit that I want to make sure we get to is, will brands disappear? Some of the brands will, and given that I saw none of you put your hands up to show me that you're following the fundamental laws of gravity, it's a good chance that it might be your brands that will disappear. But there are a lot of brands that won't disappear because brands are useful to manufacturers, they're useful to retailers, and most importantly, they're useful to shoppers. But they're not useful for shoppers for the reasons that most marketers talk about and believe. They're useful to shoppers because they're a mental shortcut that makes it easy for people to know that that's a brand that they can trust, that a brand that is worth them considering. So when we study this, we see that absolutely, without question, people are cognitive misers. Our brains are hardwired for that. We don't want to think, and we avoid thinking as often as we can. And the huge advantage of brands is They let us get on with our lives without having to think about the many choices that we make. So I think I've covered that. So I'm going to just kind of end with the key lessons in terms of the rules to build a brand and how to grow. Focus on penetration. Focus on category buyers and talk to as many of them as you can. You don't have to say anything much, but you do have to have colours that stand out, shapes that get noticed, things that people don't have to think about. Scrap loyalty from any business plan that you've got. Don't bother about measuring it if you want to grow. You know, if you want to be in that lovey space, fine, but it's not the route to growth. So your light and non-buyers are the buyers that matter most. You need to be easy to buy. Remove any barrier that makes it hard for someone to think about you or to purchase you. Be salient. So give people mental structures that make it easy for them to think about you in the broad range of situations when it might be relevant for them to make a category purchase. Be distinctive and brand. Now, I can stop there, but if you... One more minute? Beautiful. So what you shouldn't do is have the goal of increasing loyalty. Ignore rejection for the most part. Absolutely, if, like my plane on the way here, where it was going down at high speed and the bottom of the plane was burst out and the mayday calls, there's a time to worry. But for most brands, most of the time, rejection is very, very small. The biggest challenge is just being considered at all. So don't prioritise differentiating your brand. You don't need to have a unique positioning apart, or you don't need a unique positioning. That's not the route to growth. You do have to be distinctive and stand out. And some of the stuff we've been hearing this morning, you have to have a story. You have to know what your brand is all about, and you have to be entirely consistent to that. So I love the juice example because he had his story, he had his brand. But what you don't worry about is who's going to buy that. And don't worry about appealing to a segmentation, to a particular segment. And ignore this idea of needing to persuade. Most people don't think. You don't need to. If you just want to grow, there are different ways to do it. So remember the fundamental rules. I've kind of had them. And if you want to be big, it's about having greater mental and physical availability. And there's a lot more detail in Byron's book, or we've got different ways that we can share it with you. So over lunch, I welcome questions and discussion. Thank you very much.
There we go.